Their lecture of the year, I'd also like to thank the Laurier Centre for Study of Canada for their partnership in our speaker series. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this place we call Guelph has served as traditional lands and a place of refuge for many peoples over time, but more specifically the Adirondack and the Haudenosaunee. This land is held as the treaty lands and territory with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. Guelph lies directly adjacent to the Haldimand Track and is part of a long-established traditional hunting ground for the Six Nations of the Grand River. Many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who have come from across Turtle Island call Guelph home today. Guelph Museums continues to build our knowledge and relationships about the land, its history, and its peoples. This commitment informs all that we do at Guelph Museums. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Bill McVean. Bill's a regular at our series, and you may have seen him in the audience several times. Bill started his career as a railroader. He was 21 years as a trainman and conductor and 21 years as a rail traffic controller or dispatcher. And then he was also a rail historian. But I guess he said that at the time when he was working with the railway, he said, until I've walked every old Canadian railbed, I have no interest in leaving the country. But Bill's interest changed in 2007 when he accompanied his mother on the Bridge Too Far battlefield tour to Arnhem in the Netherlands. Bill Sr. was a World War II tail gunner with the RCAF, and after retirement moved the McVeans. The McVeans traveled on many battlefield tours, and Bill joined the Arnhem 1944 Fellowship, which welcomes interested parties to join Arnhem veterans continuing this legacy. One of the activities of the group is the annual battlefield walk talk each September. And Bill missed out this year, but he's been in the past. In 2013, Bill presented Operation Berlin and the story of the Canadian action and the evacuation of the British First Airborne from Arnhem. And it was delivered with the Rhine River in the background. So we don't have the Rhine River in our background for your talk tonight,
no,
but we have a picture of the engine that we use.
Well, it's not the engine, but that's part of my story.
So put your hands together and thank you.
In 1956, my grandfather bought one of these motors, a 30 horsepower Evinrude, and we were told it was the first time Evinrude had built a motor bigger than 25 horsepower. But half a century later, I heard about the Canadians doing an evacuation of troops from Arnhem, and they used 50 horsepower motors. So I thought that can't be right. So it's what got me kind of into this. So I can point this anywhere. Right. So what I'm going to talk about is part of Operation Market Garden. So Market was airborne troops, paratroopers, and glider-bound troops would drop into the Netherlands, secure all the bridges before the Germans blew them up retreating, and then Garden was the British Army led by 30 Corps tanks and the Army would sweep through the Netherlands, swing into Germany, and the war would be over by Christmas '44. Now, we all know that didn't happen. So what the idea was, the airborne would take all the bridges in this area, and then the tanks would come. The Americans were at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, the British at Arnhem. This is General Montgomery. He was the chief for the head of the British Army, and this is Frederick Browning. He was in charge of the British Airborne. They were the ones who were going to take credit for this, but then when it failed, they did the CPR salute. It's his fault. And then what we're going to key in is the Battle of Arnhem and Oosterbeek. Now everyone talks about Arnhem. The British took the one end of the bridge, they held it for 4 days. And that's what they were told. The army was going to be there in 2 days, 4 at the most. So the British Airborne did what they were supposed to do. They held the bridge for 4 days, then they were overrun. The 30 Corps never did show up. Operation Berlin came at the end when the British figured they were done with the troops at Arnhem. They weren't going to get any stronger. So they evacuated them across the Rhine. This is Bernard Osborne, no E on Osborne. I don't know why he thought that was important, but he was a glider pilot, British military glider pilot. And he was on the battlefield tour that I was on. And we went to at Arnhem, the first stop is usually the recce ambush. They explain it to you. And then they said, we've got a veteran of the battle with us, Bernard Osborne, and would he say a few words? So he came up, and he wasn't a razzle-dazzle guy, but you knew he was used to speaking. And he, in a sentence, kind of defined what had happened at Arnhem, and it's that there wasn't a line of Germans and a line of British, and bang, they fought. It was street fighting, houses, in forests. It was just a terrible mishmash. Because he said this is the first day, and he referred to this recce ambush where the Germans just stopped the initial British charge to the bridge. He said, these poor guys are being shot to pieces. And he said, I was just up there a few hundred yards brewing tea, because when the glider pilots landed at Arnhem, they stayed at the landing zone to protect it for the next day, just in case the Germans attacked. We became great friends. Oh, I must say, I have a great debt to the library in Westmount, Montreal, because they were involved in an interlibrary loan system. And they got books from all over Canada. You gave them a name, and they would search all of Canada. Parliament has a library, the universities have libraries. So I had books, and you could get books that were written just after the war, where veterans were telling their story. Whereas now most of the books are, authors are saying, well, they should have done this, they should have done that. And all these authors are doing is reading the research that university students have done for them. They really don't understand what they're writing about. The baseball cap he has on is Canadian Military Engineers Crest baseball cap, which I got for him, and I got him a tie pin and a mug. And the picture was taken at the Bromley football stadium, which is soccer, where he would go to watch his Bromley football club play. And he said, people will come up to me and say, what's that hat? And he'll say, the Canadian Engineers logo, they got me out of Arnhem. So he was on this tour. Well, he did a speech, and then we're walking back to the bus because you had to come down a bit of a farm lane. And the two tour guides are on each side of him, and they're walking. I'm behind. I don't listen to other people's conversations, God knowing. But I hear the word Canadian come drifting back, and I said, what's that about Canadian? And he turned around and said, oh, they got us out at the end of the battle. Most people didn't know this because it was a British battle, it was British people who wrote the history, and even veterans I talked to, because the veterans who got out were 9 days, very little to eat. They were drinking water out of radiators. It was just a terrible experience, and most of them didn't know what day it was, and for 12 hours a day they were being shelled. Just the noise, never mind what was so most of them didn't know they had got out with Canadians. But he was the one who got me going on this. This was the main British glider. It's called a Horsa, and it would carry 20 troops. And this is important because the movies get this fouled up. 20 troops, or a jeep and an artillery gun. But you couldn't get 20 troops and the jeep and the artillery gun. The movie In Search of Private Ryan, they've got that fouled up. And Bernard, he said he loved this thing. He said it just flew so beautifully, and they did have compressed air, container compressed air, so they had flaps that would so the idea was they would come, and when they got to where they had to be, they would kind of go straight down, and then at the last minute come out, so they weren't up in the sky as a target for as long.
Can you move that microphone so he can use it? He's not using it.
Oh, thank you. This, of course, is Prince Charles. This is the 75th anniversary and one of the glider pilots, and this is the cockpit of a glider. And the building you see in the back was the Hartenstein Hotel. The British took it over.
The speaker's covered up.
Oh. The British took it over as their headquarters, and after the war it became the Airborne Museum. Now you can see the size of this is a glider, and just off in the corner is one of the tires. Those tires are 6 feet high, just to give you an idea of the scale. And the smaller glider, the back tail would come off, and that was a door to get the equipment out. With this one, they just opened the front, but one of the glider pilots would take his pistol and put a hole in each tire, and that brought it down. Because the gliders were generally not reused. Once they were used, that was the end. Now, well, I've got to go back a bit. Airborne, the parachuting, I believe, from what I read, was the Polish people, but it was just like they built towers, and it was like at a fair, you would jump off with a parachute. It was the Germans who made parachuting and military gliders a military activity. And I read from some of the things that they had to sign with the truce after the First World War restricted them from using airplanes for military. So this is where the gliders came in, and they took, at the start of the war, they took a fortress on the Belgian border that everyone thought just couldn't be taken. This got Churchill quite interested when this fort fell, and he ordered the British military to get going on airborne stuff. Well, 6 months later, he said, how are things going? And no one had done anything. So he kind of went on the war path and got it going. There was I don't know if they didn't want to do it or they didn't want the other guy to do it, but there was an argument between the Army and the Air Force who was going to be in charge of this stuff. Well, they had a saw-off, and it was, while the troops are in the air, it's an Air Force operation. Once they hit the ground, it's an Army operation. The problem with that is the Army wanted to land right where the action was. The Air Force didn't want to take their planes too close to the action because they'd lose planes. So at Arnhem, they were after the bridge, which is there, but here's where the drops, this is 8 miles to the bridge. And as one of the officers said, when the first parachute comes out of a plane, any fool of a German is going to know you're after the bridge. So it gave the Germans lots of opportunity to get ready. The other bad thing here, that's where their supplies were dropped as the battle went on, but where they ended up fighting after they lost the bridge was kind of a horseshoe shape above the Rhine. So most of their supplies they didn't get. So that as the British guys were captured, in where they were, or they were injured in they ended up in a German hospital, they were being given British cigarettes and British chocolates. But and this was because the Air Force, who was in charge till they landed, wouldn't go any closer to Arnhem because the bridge was protected with a great deal of anti-aircraft. What the glider pilot regiment wanted was they wanted to fly right in on the bridge, and it was a big structure, and just get the wings sheared off the gliders, and they'd be right there, but the Air Force wouldn't have anything to do with that. Just before we talk about the engineers and what they did, probably one of the best inventions during the war, maybe except for the atom bomb, was the Bailey Bridge. When armies retreat, they blow up the bridges behind them, and it's a big problem. Donald Bailey came up with this idea of panels that were, I've got to speak imperial measure here, 10 feet. And it was a male and female with a pin, top and bottom, but it was precisely made so when they joined two panels together, it was like having one. So now this is one, the other great thing, they get anyone interested in house building, if you need a beam of any length, then maybe you'll put 3 or 4 2x10s together to make the beam strong. They could put 4 of these panels together to carry a heavier load. The other, when they built these things, they build them on one side and they called it, they'd launch them. And they had special panels to lead, which were like slave blades. They came up on an angle. So when the bridge went over, instead of digging into the ground, it would just slide along. So like there was a great deal of thinking to these things. This is probably the most famous bridge of the Second World War in a place called Anzio in Italy. The Germans and Italians are still on the other side shooting, and they built this under fire. So you can see the end pieces, how they went up. And when they launched it, so it wouldn't tip, they would have pig iron here. And because this was a fairly big bridge, they had a bulldozer. A number of the British engineers were killed building this because they were being shot at. And this is just at Christchurch where the British engineers had their test areas. It was before computers where they could calculate load, so they just put tanks up on to see what it would hold. This is Donald Bailey on the left. And this is a Bailey bridge that was built after the war to get a bridge done. But this is the other great thing about the bridge. You didn't have to know anything about engineering if you were up there. All you had to do where a bridge was required was measure the span and find out what the maximum load was going to be on that bridge. Was it just going to be troops? Or was it going to be big tanks? That information would go back to the supply area, and they would just go to their books, load, span, and send up what was required for that bridge. They also had Bailey Bridge pontoons, so if they had to go over a big piece of water, they could do that. And at the far end, you can see how they built the bridge onto the land. That would be if they didn't have a good footing. It would be like being out in a forest or a field and someone has put a plank across a creek. The plank just doesn't go a little bit beyond. It goes way beyond to spread the weight. Now, this is a kind of a sneaky way of introducing the star of the show, and it's right there. This is a smaller paddle boat, but this is a storm boat with a 50 horsepower Evinrude motor. And as silly as this is going to sound, that's probably the best picture you'll see of one of these things. This tells you what it's really like. 2 bench seats, carry about 20 troops, fully equipped. Or they came with 2 adjustable steel ramps that they could put a Jeep in there, or they could put a gun, artillery piece on wheels. Oh, wrong way. So you can see it's a storm boat with a Jeep in it, but it's just a terrible photograph. This is what powered it. It was a 50 horsepower. Very early days of outboard motors. The gas tank was still on the motor, so you wouldn't go very far with a 50 horsepower motor with them refilling. And they were, if you imagine a lawnmower, when you pull a lawnmower to start it, the blade's going around. They didn't have a neutral or reverse. The propeller was turning, but there was a speed control. And just one other thing that's a little different, this fin was put on in case they got into areas where the enemy had put barbed wire into the water. And theoretically, that fin would keep the barbed wire away from the propeller. And I have been able to acquire 3 of them, and it's been the same story with all of them. They got put in the back of a shed, and then over the years more junk went in, and at some point they cleared out, and this thing was there. A collector had it, and I told him I was going to donate it to the base at Petawawa. The 23rd Field Company, which I'll talk about, with amalgamation and everything, they would have ended up at Petawawa at the base. And in their building, this is in the entrance, and they have a display of Operation Berlin. And the building is called the Nader Rhine Building, which is the proper name of the river that they crossed that night. And this is just some other angles of the motor. This was the big fault. They'd never used these motors in training in the rain. The spark plugs were, not totally, but they were exposed to the rain. And it rained that night. The flywheel, this is the gas. Now anyone would remember the old way you started things. It was a rope with a big knot and a wooden handle at the end. And you would put the knot in there, wrap it around a few times and pull. But when it got around to this side, the knot would come loose. And hopefully you just did it all again. This is an assault boat. Now it's a goofy name because any boat that takes people across the river in war is an assault boat. It's like General Motors bringing out an automobile and calling it the car. Well, it is a car. The storm boat is an assault boat. It takes people across. But anyways, because there's great confusion. But it was just a canvas wood frame which you could take the slats out, it would go flat. And it was easy to carry. The Canadians had the power boats in what we're going to talk about. The British engineering guys had these things, and with the current on the Rhine, it was taking 6 to 8 paddlers to bring 2 out. These are the 2 important gentlemen in this for the 23rd Field Company. Closest to us is Lieutenant Russ Kennedy. He was the reconnaissance officer, and behind is Colonel Mike Tucker. He was the commanding officer. This was the plan for the evacuation. 23rd Field Company, one of the British companies, British Company and the 20th Field Company. There was bad communication between Arnhem and the forces back at Nijmegen. Where the 1 and 2 were going to go, any topographic map reader, that's a very steep bank. It was a high part. The British had held it until Wednesday. They lost it on Wednesday. They tried to retake it Thursday. They were unsuccessful. So the Germans were up there. Over the 80 years, there are a number of trees have grown up on the bank. When you're up there, it's hard to see what's going on, but during the war there was nothing there. But if you're up there today, you can kind of poke through the trees, and where the Canadians were, there is an engineer's memorial, so you can see it from up there. But it was an excellent spot to be for the Germans with snipers and machine guns for any activity on the river. Well, I'm ahead of myself here. What have I done? So the Canadians are in this massive line with 30 Corps because it was about 20 miles long. Because they had Bailey bridges, they had supplies, they had ammunition for the tanks. On Wednesday, the Canadians and the British engineers are called to come to the front. So it's it's 2-lane road, and Russ Kennedy, who I got to know very well, he said it was just marvelous the way the British MPs, they just had to drive everybody off the road, all the empty trucks coming back to be refilled with food and ammunition, and they shoot up to the front at Nijmegen. he goes out Wednesday night and does a reconnaissance at the river for an assault crossing. The assault crossing never happens. He goes out again Friday night and does another reconnaissance, again for an assault crossing. It never happens. Because the 30 Corps is having trouble getting everybody up there to the river. Eventually, on Monday morning, Colonel Tucker is called to a meeting and he's told it's now an evacuation. Colonel Tucker wanted to do an assault crossing, but they said it's an evacuation. So Russ Kennedy and his Jeep driver, Buck McKee, and I said to him once, why did you have a Jeep driver? You were 25 years old. And he said these Jeeps were so scarce that if he went to a meeting and left the Jeep outside alone, it would be stolen by an Australian, an American, or the wheels would all be gone. So you always had to have someone with your Jeep. Because they're going to go up and do this reconnaissance in daylight, and because of the snipers, he sends two Jeeps up. Bob Tate and Don Barnes go as well. The thought is if one of them gets shot, the other guy is going to come back. And he said there were the Hampshire regiment were up there kind of holding the front, but there was no action. And he said, and this was true from the First World War, the troops at the front line didn't want visitors. They didn't want the Prince of Wales to come up and tell them they were doing a good job, because whenever you have that happening, there's all sorts of activity for security. And the Germans say, oh, something's going on over there. They're going to charge, we better start shelling them. So the guys in the First World War don't come, because we'll get a day full of shells coming at us because the Germans think there's activity. And it was the same, the Russ and Bob Tate were told, stay down, I don't see it, I don't see it. Anyway, the plan is they can't do anything until it's dark. So they go and do that. The boats with the equipment are going to come from Nijmegen up the halfway point called Valberg. So they've got all their boats on trucks. So what they do is they look for a street that has big trees and they park under the trees, because there are still German planes, fighters, and any German who sees a truck with boats on it is going to know they're coming to the river. So that's very important. They come back and they meet up at Valberg. Now, I have to apologize to the Royal Canadian Legion. They did an article on this, and they said the Canadians launched their boats at Valberg. It's 12 kilometers from the water. Now, I know where they made the mistake. The term harbor. The Canadians brought the trucks with the boats, and they harbored at Valberg. In other words, they sat there. There's another meaning for harbor. And I guess this author who hopped, skipped, and jumped through the internet, it's all harbor, they launched their boats there. But so when they were up at doing the reconnaissance, there was one big problem they had, and that is there was a big ditch that separated the orchard that was next to the first flood wall, where they'd have to carry the boats over. They thought if they could build a little bridge that would allow the trucks to drive through the orchard right up to the flood wall, and that would save them in the round trip a half a kilometer of walking, a quarter of a kilometer up to the bank, the flood wall, and then when they came back, a quarter more kilometer to get to where the trucks would have to stay. Opposite the street where they had parked the boats was a little railway yard. And everything they needed for a bridge was there. So they took 4 ties to use 2 on each side of the ditch as a footing. They took 2 rails to act as the girders, and then more railway ties as the deck. So they did dig the first ties into the ground, so the thing wasn't too high, and then they put some dirt at each end to hold the ties in place. The guys who did that, they went up in daylight because they thought the Germans wouldn't pay much attention to a truck with some junk on it. There were no guns or anything. So I met one of the guys, or he was the closest one. I met 5 of these guys and got to know them quite well. The one who lived closest to me was in Mississauga, Don Somerville, and he said, they did throw a couple of shells at us and we jumped into that ditch. And he said, that water was the dirtiest, stinkiest thing, stuff that was ever in my life. But anyway, so they get the bridge built. Once it's dark, they're set to go. Now, Russ Kennedy's been up there 3 times already. But just when he's ready to go, British intelligence show up and they say, you can't use the main road. You've got to work your way through the back roads. And they handed him a pre-war Dutch road map. Now, there's no lights on vehicles because the bad guys can see you. The only light they had on the Jeep was under the body, so when you were driving, you could kind of look and see how fast you were going, you'd see the road. But they had to go very slow, and they couldn't. And of all the things he told me over the 5 years I knew him, this was the one where you could see that this was the gag point for him, because he said, if I ever took a wrong turn and we went down to a dead end, he said these, like, they were new trucks, but they were pretty rough, standard transmit. He said, never back one of those trucks up a mile without going in the ditch. But like finding the railway stuff for the bridge, which was good luck, he said it was pure good luck that I found where I was supposed to be. So they get the trucks up to the little bridge, and the first truck that comes to the bridge, instead of doing a big swoop to line up on it, the swoop isn't big enough, the back wheel goes off the bridge. So this is a fair-sized truck with a number of boats on it. So he said, we got all the guys, there's about 50 of them, and we try to get this truck back on. So they make a decision, they gotta dump the truck over and get it out of the way, and they'll just have to come back for the boats. So they get into the flood wall, and it's about 5 meters high, and it's a 45-degree angle, and it's grass, and it's raining. So I said to Russ, did you take the boats and then the motors down to the river? No, he said, we could be under fire at the river, and you don't start to put things together when you're going to be under fire. So we put everything together back. So the boat was close to 1,000 pounds and the motor was close to 200. So they had about 5 guys on each side, and they picked the boat up, and they can't get up the flood wall. They're slipping on the grass, and it's just too heavy. They can't do anything. So military engineers, it's imagination and initiative. They did have some ropes in their trucks, so they ran a rope about 1/2 meter beyond each side of the boats, up over the flood wall, and then they staked it. And then they picked the boat up, picked the rope up, and like a banister, they pulled themselves up over the flood wall. Don Somerville had a bit of a sense of humor. He said to me once, a lot was made about how hard it was to get up over that flood wall with those boats. He said, I can't tell you how many times I went down the other side on my rear end because the damn thing had got away from us. But anyway, they get the first boat down to the river. There is some shelling, but as an older British artillery guy told me, if you can hear it, it's not going to hit you. It's the one you don't hear. That's the one that gets you, so don't worry about it. But every time they hear a shell, they drop the boat. Well, there's lots of rocks on the way down to the river. They get down with the first boat, they put it in, it's leaking. It's of no value. So back they go. They have to stop everything. Major Tucker gets a gang of them to kind of clear the route of any rocks. Now remember, they're doing this in the pitch dark. So they do that. They finally get a boat down, put it in the water. The normal crew, because there was very little control of the engine outside of which way you turned it, would be the operator, and then there'd be 2 soldiers, 2 sappers, 2 engineer soldiers in the boat with him to help going into docks or coming in or going whatever. On the first trip, they take 1 extra person, and it happens to be Russ Kennedy's best friend in the Army, Russell Martin. So the four of them go to the other side. Russell Martin's gonna stay there, and he's gonna coordinate the loading of the boats. That boat is never seen again. They were probably hit by a shell, a dead-on hit. Now, the three of the four bodies were recovered later, downstream. The one body was never recovered. One boat goes, it's successful. The third boat that goes, they go over, they get a load, they're coming back, and a shell comes in the water right beside them. And everybody in that boat does what everybody in this room would do. They jump to the other side of the boat, it flips. The only, of the three Canadians in the boat, only one survives. And he wasn't. Same name, was a hockey player for the Leafs in the 50s, Sid Smith. Sid Smith can't swim, but the way he was, when the boat flipped, he went into the water feet first, and he had a long greatcoat on, and the air came up under his coat. He just kind of floated in. But in the first three boats, they've lost 6 men. Mercifully, that would be the last losses on the river that night. Where they were carrying the boats to the river, Buck McKee, Russ Kennedy's Jeep driver, was hit by shrapnel, and he died later as the result of that. So they lost 7 that night. So it's about 3:30 in the morning when they get all the boats in the water. And they pick up all their stuff, the ropes and that, and Russ walks up to the river and sees Major Tucker, and he's told about the losses and his best friend Russell Martin. So Russ Kennedy, like these guys there were no career soldiers. They were just soldiers for the war. So Russ Kennedy says something, and I thought was goofy as soon as he said it. He asked Major Tucker if he could go to the other side and look for his friend. And Major Tucker said, "We're bringing people out. We're not sending them over." So he does the next best thing. He walks up and down the shore to see if what he finds is one of their boats that's been abandoned because of this problem with the spark plugs. Because what they're doing, they had kind of like a pie pan, and they take the spark plugs out of the motor, put them in this pan, put a little gas in, and with their backs to the Germans so they couldn't see the fire, they light a fire and it would melt the spark plugs. But he finds a boat that he thinks he'll get in and see if he can start it. Now, he wasn't trained on the boats. The officers weren't trained on the boats. They weren't trained on pile drivers or bulldozers. They were officers. Now, oh no, I've lost a shot. Anyway, Russ Kennedy, when he got out of university, he got a job on Bark Lake. It was a dammed lake for Ontario Hydro, but they were making the dam about 4 times as big. And it was going to flood a great area with thousands of trees. So he had a job to go around and survey with the help of 2 lumberjacks who would mark the trees to mark the new shoreline, so that Hydro could cut all these trees down, because the lake could be used for recreation in time, but mainly this lumber was worth a fortune that they were going to ruin with this lake. So they had a 16-foot Peterborough canoe with a 15 horsepower motor. Second day on the job, they realized the boat operator had a drinking problem. He was dismissed, and they were near a place called Barry's Bay, north of Pembroke. Back in a bit, there was a road to the dam, but that was it. Well, one of the guys doing one of the lumberjacks, he had a little experience with motors, so they went on. And then as the summer went on, Russ got on to using this 15 horsepower. So that's the amount of training he had in an outboard motor. He gets in this boat, he gets it started. So he takes it down to where Major Tucker is, and said, "Give me a couple of guys, and I'll go over." Don Somerville had told me they carried the boat down to the water and there was no one to take it away. So one of the other engineers, sappers, like entry-level guys, his name was McCready, and he was old to be doing manual labor. He was 36 years old, but he had kind of taken Don as his son, younger brother, because Don, I think he had his 18th birthday at Arnhem. So he said, there's no one there to take the boat, so McCready said to Don Somerville, get in, we'll go across. So the two of them go across. So he said they made a few trips, but on one of the trips, McCready said, okay, the boat's full, that's enough. And a British soldier came and said, I'm an officer, I've got a message, it's got to go. McCready said, the boat's full, you're not going to get in. And there was an argument. McCready pulled out his gun and said, if you want to give the message to someone in the boat, but you're not going. So this McCready seemed like a... Anyway, when Russ Kennedy gets to Tucker, Tucker gives him McCready and a young guy named Gillis. Gillis operates the motor. Russ Kennedy and McCready are up at the front, and they go across. It's getting late now. This is probably 5:30, it's probably maybe 6 o'clock. As they go close to the shore, these airborne guys start to come into the water and charge the boat. And Russ said, I put my hand on my revolver. Well, number one, I wasn't going to shoot one of them. Number two, they couldn't see the gun. Number three, if I shot the gun in the air, the Germans are going to know, oh, there's someone right down there. So he said, I put my gun back in the holster, and in a couple of minutes, too many of these guys had jumped into the boat. The boat's underwater. So they're on the north side under about 4 feet of water. They get everybody out of the boat. They get everybody to grab what they can underneath of the sun. They drag it along the bottom until, as they get to shore, it's shallower, and the nose comes out, and they're able to start sloshing a little bit, and then with their hands, and if anybody's got a helmet. Now this performance has probably taken close to an hour. There were 300 left when the operation ended. If that boat had, they maybe would have got those 300 out. But anyway, now a motor that's stalling in the rain, if it goes underwater for half an hour, it's done for the night. So they got to paddle back using their hands, and anybody's got a rifle. So they get back, they spot another one of their boats that's abandoned. He gets that going. So with that one, they tie the one they've just come back with the motor that's no good, and they spot one of the British assault boats, and they drag it over with them. Order has been restored because these guys realize what they've done. So they get these 3 boats loaded, and Kennedy called it the miracle of the night because they probably had 30 in each one and 8. So back they go. Daylight is rapidly approaching. And Russ said, I didn't feel I could order these 2 to come back with me again because we weren't going to make a round trip before it was daylight. So Gillis said, I haven't been married long, we've got a new baby, I don't want to take any more. And Kenny said, okay. McCready, now here's the guy who was kind of funny with the, he says, oh, whatever, let's go. So they don't take the assault boat, they just take the 2 storm boats. They go over, and it wasn't, I knew Russ about 3 years, and it wasn't, I keep asking him to tell me these stories over and over because it was just great to listen to. It wasn't until I'd known him a long time that he said, on that last trip, he said my knuckles were raw because I was punching these guys not to grab the boat because we were going to blunder. So the 2 boats, and he said, we're just inches above the water. I can't get the motor to start. He's pulling it, can't get the guys in the boat with McCready against his orders, and Russ yells, they cut the rope, the tow rope, and they start to paddle out on their own. It's daylight. Only 5 were able to get out of that boat. The rest of them were killed because the German snipers just, and the machine guns. McCready was one of them, and as he was going over the first flood wall, he was wounded, but he did, but they never saw him again. I tried to find him. He lived somewhere out west, And I did see a newspaper article about he got an award for what he had done. And I think he got it in Calgary, but I could never, well, of course, he would have been dead by the time I was interested, because he was 16 years older, and these guys were all in their 80s when I knew them. So the guys in Russ's boat, they see what's happened to that boat, so they're gonna wait for him to start the motor. Along the Rhine, to preserve the bank, about every 20 feet, 5 meters, they have piled rocks out into the river that are above the river, so that when the current comes, it's not gonna make a right turn at the rocks, go into the bank and then come out. It'll just go straight, and you've got a backwater. So that's where the boat was, in this backwater. The Germans are up here, but they can't see him because of these rocks. So he's trying to, finally the motor starts. But he said, we were so low in the water, I was terrified to give it too much gas, because they tend to go down a bit at the back when they start. So he said it was just dead slow all the way across. The British soldier here in the back corner, like under his elbow as he's driving, he hears a thud. He said it was like a baseball bat hitting a pillow. And this guy kind of jerks, and he's been killed. But that was the only one they hit. And I'd heard British guys talk about this as they were coming down to the river for the evacuation. He said there were German patrols, and he said, we saw them, and he said, they must have seen us, but we just hit the ground, and they just marched on by. He said, I guess they thought we won the battle, that we have to kill some more of them. And that's the exact same thing Russ said about going across. He said, I often wondered why they could have killed us all. But he said, I guess they thought they'd won and let these guys go. So they get to shore, and they get over, and it's a successful completion to this thing. Unfortunately, it was all a British battle, and the Canadians were just involved in this. And the people who wrote the history of it were British, so that it was not very well known that the Canadians had done this. And you'll still read like older books that say, the British engineers evacuated. In fact, a friend of mine in Arnhem, who's a serious collector, he's got the Royal Engineers. They have like a diary for every year. And I pulled out 1944. I always look at 1944, and I look for Arnhem, and they're doing the evacuation in the British engineers' history. So there was a couple of days after that, you could only be buried at Arnhem at the cemetery at Oosterbeek if you had been killed in battle. Like you couldn't die after the war and be buried. They have loosened it up. They let you bury ashes now. At one time you had to take your ashes kind of to the border. So there was a long-time British engineer who was involved in the Arnhem 1904 Fellowship. He'd been a career soldier. His ashes were being buried, and there were some British soldiers there, engineers. And I figured which ones they spotted the commanding officer, and I said to him, I was looking at the 1944 Royal Engineers history, and it said that they did the evacuation. He put his hand up before I finished. He says, everybody knows the Canadians did that. Don't worry. That was changed in a reprint of the book. These are John Crossan and George Barton. John was a sniper. George was an artilleryman. George was captured. John got out with the Canadians. And there was a special weekend in Woodhall Spa, which is northern England, and that's where they trained before they went to Arnhem. There was a special commemorative weekend for the King's Own Scottish Borders. I knew about it in advance. They had a museum, and I acquired that motor in Britain. And I asked them if they'd like to display the motor, which they were thrilled to. So I phoned George Barton at home before they went. And I said, told him about the airport mortar. I said, don't say anything to John about it, but just say to him when you go in the museum, there's something in here you'll recognize that I won't. And every time I saw him after that, he'd say, that propeller was so small, the teeny little propeller. And he was one of the ones that their motor died and they grabbed the other boat. It's that teeny little propeller. But they were both involved in something in the fighting in the Oosterbeek. The Germans were coming down like these roads in the Netherlands, in the towns, are quite narrow. I don't know how cars go by, but there was a German tank coming with troops behind them. John's in the second floor somewhere as a sniper. George is able to get his artillery piece lined up, and he scores a hit on the tank, so it's knocked out. Well, the German troops, they retreat. The King's Own Scottish Borderers, they run after them, and one of the King's Own Scottish Borderers, he had a gun which was a rapid fire. It was called a Sten gun, and it was quickly made by the British. And from what I've read, a part of it was a piece of plumber's pipe that they used. Well, they would jam, and the way you would unjam it is you grab the barrel and you give it a smack on the end, and it was but Sam Cassidy, now he's chasing the Germans, and when he does this, he's killed by the, John Crossan saw that happen, but he didn't want to say anything, and the guy was killed, and that was it. Well, then after the war, King's Own Scottish Borderers had a magazine, and every now and then Sam Cassidy's family would say, does anyone know what happened? And that was just another point that with this fighting ongoing, there were no ceremonies when they buried people. They just buried them to get them underground so they're, they wouldn't rot. There's a better word to say that. And some of the first aid places, they said the bodies at the back were just piled up like cordwood because they just take them out and get back into hell. And no one had time to bury. So that when the Germans finally came through after it was all over, they just dug massive pits and buried these people. So John made a mistake. He told somebody about this Sam Cassidy. Well, once you've told somebody, you don't know who they're going to tell. So he did contact the family and tell them. The daughter came back, and she had the address where this had happened, so she went and she put a poppy. And there were some other people, because not too far away was a hotel, a small hotel, and the King's Own Scottish Borderers had fought around this hotel, and they would have a little do on Sunday afternoon of the commemoration weekend. So she came up and put a poppy in front of this house. She left it there. The next year she came back, and the poppy's there. Then someone came out of one of the houses and said, we took the poppy in a week after, and we put it out. Because the Dutch people, like a lot of the British veterans wouldn't go back after the war because they'd lost the battle. A number of Dutch people were killed, and the Germans made everybody move out of Arnhem and Oosterbeek because they had helped the British. So these people had to go and find new places to live. So they thought the Dutch people would be furious with them for what had happened, but Dutch people said, it gave us hope that someone was thinking about us. So I was there one year, and it became an annual thing that the Sam Cassidy's daughter and his granddaughter, when I was there, would walk up to this house, and I mean, there wouldn't be a service, we'd walk up. Well, there was 18 of us walked up this time, and the neighbors next door, a lady came out and said, we'd like to have you all in for coffee. Well, there was 18 of us, so a couple of the British guys were, we can't go in there. The sensitive, considerate Canadian said, I think if we don't go in, these people are going to be insulted. So in we trooped, and well, they had a big table in the backyard. They had a beautiful garden, and there was a daughter, husband, and wife, and bringing out every chair they had in the house. But sitting there with those people, it was like a sacred space or something. And I just talked to one of the guys I talked to in Britain. His father was in the South Stafford Regiment, and he's been going back since he was a teenager. And he said, you know, after the 50th anniversary, people, as the 50th was coming up, people were saying, well, I guess this will be the end of it. And the Dutch people said, well, you guys don't want to come, that's fine, but we're going to keep going. And this year with the 80th, there's a parachute drop on the Saturday at one of the drop zones, which was never developed. And it's the Dutch Army, and usually the Canadians have been there to do it. There's about 10,000 people normally go. They figured there was 100,000 this year. Because like my friends over there, I haven't been since COVID. I don't know about getting on a plane with 5,000 people and 3 square feet. It's, all of a sudden it's not. But I had some medical stuff going on, and I wouldn't have been able to get insurance. So, but my friend, he said, I hardly went to anything. I just went to the service in the cemetery, because you couldn't park anywhere. You had to park miles away, and then there were shuttle buses to bring people. So this is the church service on Sunday, and that's the Canadian ambassador. And you really can't see him, but that's the Canadian Defense Attaché. And it's unusual. You have some people who are really into this stuff, the memorial services, the Canadians, and then you have others, and you see them. Is this over yet? So it's good when you get ones who are really into it, and these two were into it. At the end of the church service, and I should have something, at the end, they must be in touch with this plane by radio, because just as the church service ends, this thing comes in right over the treetops. It almost shakes the ground. And one year they had a Spitfire come in right behind it. Every year, I'm ahead of myself. Just as the church service is entering, all the school kids from the Arnhem area, and there's about 1,500 graves in the cemetery, come in with flowers, and all these kids put the flowers. And this is why my mother wanted to go again after my father passed away. She just loved this part with the kids coming in. Every year, I get sand from somewhere in Canada that's tied into one of the veterans or something. Now I put it on a baking pan, and it's out in the sun for 5 hours, and it goes in the oven for half an hour at 450 degrees, so I'm not taking any Canadian germs over there. And I put it in little containers. Now that year there were some Canadians. So this is Buck McKee, who was killed on the south side of the river. All the others were in the river and were recovered, and wherever they were recovered, that's where they were buried. So I bring sand from Canada, and I get some of the Dutch kids to sprinkle some sand on his grave. And the thing is, he didn't come back to Canada, so we bring some Canada to him. So yeah, they're all quite happy to do this. And that's one of the Dutch kids doing it. And right there is a little, it's a plastic letter holder, and I set that up a week before the commemoration. It just talks about McKee being killed, carrying the boats, and I mentioned that few, if any, people know the Canadians, what they did, and then it's the list of the 7. And I leave it. And what happens in the Commonwealth War graves with this, at this time, they leave stuff for about a week, and then they clear it. They clear it all up. This is the Engineers Memorial that's on the other side of the river. And there is a Saturday afternoon, there's the annual service for the, now it's the Engineers Memorial. It should be the Canadian Engineers Memorial, because there were no British engineers lost in this. But and this is the same thing. I give some of them sand to sprinkle there. This lady, Elise von Beckham, she was where her parents are buried, visiting the grave, but it's on another river. And she noticed a grave, a Commonwealth War grave, headstone, and it was one of the Canadians who was killed in this. So she did research and couldn't understand how his body got under that other river, because the river doesn't join up. And then there was a thought, well, maybe he was captured and he died as a captive, and the Germans buried him there. But she got right into this, and she found these two guys were in their 60s, but they'd been kids during the war, and the Germans still controlled that area where he is buried, where his parents are. And they saw a body in the Rhine where one of their fathers operated a ferry, so he got in the thing, went out, brought it, gave it to the Germans, and they were the ones, for whatever reason, transported it. But it was this big mystery that this lady solved. But she has got really into the Canadian action. She's been to Canada all sorts of times. There is money in the family. She's been to Canada all sorts of times. She met families of the guys who were involved. It's quite a thing. But her big thing now is a project called Faces to Graves. It started in the Groesbeek cemetery, Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery. If the vast majority in a cemetery is Canadian, then they'll call it the Canadian Groesbeek. But there are other, like crews and bombers that were shot down and killed, they might be in there. But they have this project, and they want to get a photograph of everyone who's buried. And now, my friend who's very intuitive, he said, they waited 50 years too long to do this, because now the youngest veterans are in their mid-90s, so any brothers and sisters are going to be up there too. Now, I've helped. There's a small town called Gogama. Anyone ever heard of Gogama?
Yep.
Yep, north of Sudbury, way out on its own. By going to the Commonwealth War Grave Society, Commonwealth War Grave Commission website, they have a search place. And if you have a name, so whenever I'm in a town, I write down all the names off the cenotaph, and I search for their names, and they'll tell you where they're buried. So any of them buried in the Netherlands, I find out what cemetery they're in and try to contact family. Now, John Jones, who was killed and is in the Netherlands and came from Toronto, never gonna find him. But in Gogama, they found a name and the Gogama phone listing, and found the same name, and I phoned and explained, and the man I talked to said, "You're talking about my uncle." So he sent me a picture, which I sent to them. But it's quite it's a nice thing for the veterans' family. I found in Coldwater, Ontario, a sister of a chap that's buried at Groesbeek, and they did, I think last year or 2 years ago, they did a film where they made it actually, like it's online, the pictures, but they made a photograph of all the people in this Groesbeek museum, and they had a special, like a piece of wood, a frame that would fit over the grave, and then a piece of wood that came out, and then a piece of wood that went down with a spike on it. So they put it over the headstone for every headstone, and they'd have the photos in the exact same spot. And they did this video, and gee, if I didn't see Ross Brissett's picture, so his sister, it was her daughter I would talk to about all this stuff, and I told her about, go to this website and you're going to see. So she showed her mother and sent me an email. Oh, we're so thrilled to see Ross's. So it's nice for the memory of these guys too. So. After the war, because of all these battlefield graves, that there were 1,000 of these people, and they are from the Dutch Recovery Unit. They're in the army. After the war, there was 1,000 of these people exhuming bodies all over the place, because all the fatalities from the war were going to be in these Commonwealth War graves. There were bomber crews that crashed in the Netherlands, and they were killed, or some of them were killed. The town would have a service, bury them in the church cemetery or the village cemetery, Commonwealth War graves came along and said, okay, we're gonna take these bodies. And there was some fight back. So what was agreed, that if the Commonwealth War grave people could have access to the cemetery at all time, meaning if you lock it, we gotta have a key, they would do the maintenance of the grave, and something I'd never heard of, the grave has to be there for perpetuity, forever. In Europe, because they don't have much land, you're in a grave for 20 years. If you want to be there longer, you've got to pay more money. If you don't pay, then they exhume the body and it goes to a mass grave somewhere. So that was because the people in East Village said they're part of our community. They died here, we buried them here. So very rarely is there construction in the Arnhem area where they don't find remains. So once remains are found, everything stops. These people come. Now, I met one of them at a meeting, and he explained to me what he did. It's kind of goofy, but then through my friend, we had a tour of their place. So usually, if they're buried, the uniform is preserved. So they're able to say, King's Own Scottish Borderer, Sergeant. And if you're knowledgeable in this stuff, there's a bone in your leg that they can look at and say, probably about 30 years old. So with that information, they contact the British and they say, King's Own Scottish Borderer, Sergeant, about 35 years old. Anybody who fits that description, send their dental records, and they're able to identify them. What they can't identify is a head wound, because if the teeth are not there, then they can't, but through the process of elimination, so in the cemetery, there are the people who are known, then there will be an unknown soldier or an unknown Scottish borderer's sergeant, but unknown. Well, if there's 3 of the sergeants missing, and they locate 2 of them, then they know who this guy is. I think I've got more here. Yeah, so this is in the lab. Now, when I had my tour, they had a German soldier. And there were all sorts of tweezers and stuff beside him that they had found. And they said he had a ribbon that showed he was in the First World War. So what would a First World War veteran be doing with tweezers and scissors? He was a doctor. Then it wouldn't matter how old he was. And they do the same with the Germans. This is, never get it, Hert Jensen. It starts with a G, I always say Kurt. But, he's the one I met who explained to me what went on, but he's very emotional because once they identify him, then the British only have a budget for so many burials a year because it's expensive. So they have to bring 6 soldiers as pallbearers, and they can't be the handiest soldiers, British soldiers they can find. They have to be from his regiment or through amalgamation, who would be part of where he would be. So they might bring these guys in from who knows where in the Arctic, where they're serving. And they will bring 2 family members if they can find them. And then of course you get the government officials who are there too. This was the 75th anniversary, and of course this is Prince Charles. And this is Lloyd Bentley from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. The forage cap of the Royal Canadian Air Force and the tie, very similar to the Royal Air Force, the British. And when Prince Charles approached him, he probably thought he was going to talk to a British guy. But Lloyd said, geez, he talked, and I did hear that Prince Charles, now whether he's king, this carries on, if he's got 3 engagements in the day, right on time for the first one, late for the second and third because he likes to talk to people. Mm-hmm. And that is one of the motors I've acquired, it's in a museum in, that's Grove Street. But the museums are, because this has all become so popular, it's like in Canada, if you get something that's popular, now you get people who want to be on the board, to be able to say, I'm on the board of the Airborne Museum. They got no interest in it, but so getting these people in, and it's kind of driving the good hard workers out because they don't like it. But, so that is the story of the evacuation, and unfortunately, modern writers are wordsmiths, and they just hop, skip, and jump through the internet, and the story gets retold, and it's wrong, and it's dopey. And then on top of that, there are some well-meaning people in the Netherlands. There was a Polish airborne brigade who were attached to the 1st Airborne. It was followed up with them going to Arnhem. They were supposed to land on the south side of the bridge to prepare things for 30 Corps when everything was taken. Well, that didn't happen. They left Britain, and then the British thought the weather was going to be bad. They called them back, but only half the planes got the message. The other half continued on. They landed on the south side. They tried to put some of them across, but it didn't work. But like the movie A Bridge Too Far, it shows these Polish guys coming down and the Germans, they're shooting. Well, that's not true. That didn't happen. Their artillery, which was in gliders, did go to the north side and were part of the action. But so you've got these Dutch people, and they have now said, because the Poles were in a town called Driel, which is about 5 kilometers where the Canadians did the operation, they've said the Poles helped the Canadians in the evacuation. Well, they were protecting the Western Front. But of course, you get the hop, skip, and jump writers, they were in the boats with the Canadians, helping the Canadians. So it's a tough battle to get the true story out there. Well, now, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I have to thank Bell Canada, because they have a flat rate to call Europe and Britain, $25 a month the last time I looked. When I started to call all these veterans and friends in the Netherlands, they thought I was a millionaire. It was just, it was just, but it's just unfortunate that the story can get changed, and now someone else reads it and they pass the wrong story on. But all the guys I met, the one was in Vancouver, Jerry Godet, and he thought the Bailey Bridge was just the greatest invention. He was a mechanical guy, worked for one of the bottling companies, and I asked him, I said, what did you think of those Evan routes? He said, they were junk, they were junk, they were junk. Now, he had a 50 horsepower outboard in the 70s, and he was on the Fraser River, and it conked out. Now, he wasn't going to be blown out to sea, but someone had to try. I think that was part of it. And then on the East Coast, Bob Tate, I had a big conversation with him on the radio, on the telephone. I drove down and spent a lot of time with him one day, but he passed away shortly after. Eamon Hudson was in New Brunswick. Russ Kennedy was in Kingston, and Don Somerville was in Somerville. So Kennedy and Somerville. I was working in Montreal, but I had funny hours, so I had a big weekend. So I came back most weekends. So once a month or every 6 weeks, I'd beat in and see Russ. But he wasn't anxious. I got gas in Kingston one day, and I had read that he'd become a professor at Queen's. So there was a phone booth and a phone book. And I phoned Russell Kennedy, and this gentleman answered, and I said, is that Russell Kennedy? He said, yes. And I said, Hero of Arnhem? And he said, what do you want? I'd found him. So now the CPR never tell the truth or a lie will fit. I said, well, I'm really interested in Arnhem, and I just wondered if you had anything I could read. Well, if I went to pick it up, I was going to meet him. And he said, oh, I got, give a talk. So I made up on my way back to Montreal on Wednesday afternoon, 1 o'clock. Showed up at his house, and he had me in, and we went downstairs. He had an office downstairs, it was split level, so you looked out on the garden. So, we talked, and it was good. And then 2 weeks later, I phoned him again and I said, you know, what we talked about, I got some questions, can I come and see you again? And he said, oh, yeah, I guess so. So that time we went downstairs and he stopped and he said, you know, I don't like to talk about this because I don't want to be misquoted. I said, I wanted to misquote you, I wouldn't even talk to you. So he thought that was all right. So that kind of opened the way and we became good friends. But he was like, I think I amused him. And then when I told him I bought a motor, he thought, this guy's crazy. But he was a good, solid guy. Like, he wouldn't exaggerate or do anything. He was a good. And Don Somerville, he told me some stuff, like just that had happened to him. And I would ask him again and again, and you know, it was always dead the same. So when it's dead the same, I believe. There are British veterans who came back and wrote books, especially the ones who got out with the Canadians, because the other ones who were captured didn't get out. It was half a year later in May. And when those guys got back, some of the guys who'd written stuff had to retract it because they'd taken the credit for doing all sorts of things. And there was a well-known veteran in Canada. He'd been involved in a couple of organizations, and he claimed he'd been at Arnhem. So I phoned my friends and I said, I found another veteran. It was a Canlone officer. And I got an email back the next day. They said, be careful here, we don't see his name in any of the records. Oh, Canlone. I said, just as the war was grinding on, the British were losing officers, because you can say what you like about the British. The officer leads the charge. There were 3 bayonet charges in Arnhem. And the guy who I gave you the link that's interviewed, I asked him, I said, how do you organize a bayonet charge? And he said, Peyton Reed, the commanding officer, just yelled out, fix your bayonets, we're going to get the so-and-sos. And we did. And but anyway, the British were losing officers, and they approached Canada. This is the version I've read that I think is true. Not that Canada said we've got too many officers. The British approached them, said we need officers. So the Canlone program was set up. Canadian trained officers could apply to go with the British Army. And some of them, whose fathers had been in the First World War, asked if they could go with their father's regiment. And I met a number of these guys, and they all said the same thing. I didn't want to train in Canada. I wanted to get into the war. And on the flip side, I talked to a lot of the British, like the King's Own Scottish Borders. I think they had 4 Canlone officers. And every British guy I talked to had the same story. Like, they said they were good officers and, you know, they were concerned about us in battle and all the regular stuff. But they said, in Britain, it's a class system. After training, the infantry guys went that way, the officers went that way. The officers didn't hang out with their men. But they said the Canlone officers, when we went that way, they came with us. They hung out with us. So they had a real special feeling for the Canadians. Have I gone over the mark?
A little bit, but I think it was been fantastic. Can we take a couple questions?
Oh, I'm good all night. And Tim Horton's not too far. If we get kicked out of here, we can.
Do you have any?
How many, I'm sorry, I'm sure you said this during your presentation, but how many were they, of these paratroopers, were they actually able to evacuate?
Oh, you know, I didn't mention that. It's, I mentioned Tucker was the commanding officer, and War Diaries, which is what happens. I think he was a gung-ho guy, and maybe he embellished some stuff, because they got 2,400 out. Now, they know that because every British soldier that got back to Nijmegen, there were officers there to check off. So there were about 2,400. Now, Tucker said they made 150 trips with the boats. Well, if you divide 150 into 2,400, that's only 16 in each boat. The boats would carry 30 troops with equipment. surely they weren't leaving with just 16, well, there was hundreds of them standing. So it's in the war diary, but I think Tucker just made that one up to make it sound good, but it's kind of dopey when you...
I've sort of been interested in military history all my life, but this is a pocket of the war that I've not really had a chance to read anything about. And I just wondered, because of all the truths and untruths that you've sort of mentioned, which would you consider to be the best read? That is probably closest to the accuracy.
He was British, but he came to Canada, and I think he was in I don't know, Union stuff. But anyway, I can't think of his name, but his book was called A Magnificent Disaster.
Magnificent Disaster.
Yeah,
Right.
or the one that got it all started, A Bridge Too Far. It's pretty good, but I don't know if it deals too much with the Canadians. That's the problem. Most of them didn't know too much that and there is a small paperback called The Stormboat Kings. It was written by a Canadian guy from Toronto, and it's a good, but it kind of follows them before and then after through the war. But
I need to write these down before we leave, if you don't mind.
But the big books that are coming out from Britain, they're well-known authors. But as I say, they just get university people to do the research and they craft. And Max Grimes, I think is his name. He has paratroopers jumping out of gliders. You know, that the record flight for a glider, now they landed for fuel, the plane, was from Dorval Airport in Montreal. They landed at Gander for fuel, and then they went to Scotland. And the glider had medical supplies. But there was nothing in the plane because, you know, they can only, so some smart Alex Scotch guy said when they got over there, why didn't you bring a glider? Why didn't you put the stuff in the plane?
Yeah. So
One of the pictures you had there was three researchers standing around a table with the remnants.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So, was that done right on site of a grave or something? It looked like it was,
Oh,
like
well,
the walls were there and it looked like it was on grass or something.
yeah, well, they exhume everything. And I guess they put it on the table and then they go to like a lab and do the real, you know. But yeah, they go out, they set up a tent and it's illegal to have a metal detector in Arnhem. You have to have a license. And about 5 years ago, one of the young kids went into school and said to the teacher, "What's that?" Well, it was a hand grenade. So they had to give a course in hand grenades to all the kids. Don't touch these things. But as he said, construction, they usually find something.
how many were taken as prisoners of war?
Oh, in the whole thing?
No, in this Arnhem.
Well, 10,000 went in, 2,400 got out, and I think it was about half of that were either killed or the other half were prisoners. But as I said, the prisoners were treated well because there were British cigarettes and British chocolates because all the stuff went to the Germans. And the pilots were told in any of this stuff, don't pay any attention to anyone waving at you on the ground because it could be Germans trying to entice you to drop the stuff in the wrong place. But the other thing I wondered about, and Jeff Roberts, who on that link is interviewed, for many years his niece and her husband would bring him. And her husband, he was a career guy in the tank corps. And I asked him one day, I said, all this stuff about Arnhem and everything, do today's paratroopers kind of get sick of this? And it's the same when I go up to Petawawa, they have a commemoration thing on in September about what the engineers did. I think, oh, these guys get sick of hearing about this. But he He said, oh, no, 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 no. He said, the tank corps, we came from the cavalry. Because when the machine gun showed up, there was no more horse charges. So that's when the tank came in. So he said, we came from the cavalry. The battle that is our heritage battle is the Battle of Waterloo, which is a cavalry battle. But it's their heritage, and that's what they celebrate. So it was just a thing I would never thought. I just thought these guys would be sick
Yeah.
of hearing about Arnhem.
Well, thank you, that was all very nice, very interesting.
Well,
Okay.
say that.
Well,
Thank
thank
you
you for your attention. Oh, now
Thank you so much, Bill.
I have a question. Where's my, oh.
Where's that?
This I found in an Old Sound newspaper, October 1944, just after Arnhem. But it's for victory bonds to raise money. But it was sponsored by Blue Top Brewery in Waterloo. Has anyone ever heard of Blue Top Brewery? I know it existed, but I've never been able to find anything, why they did this or what the reason was. And in the official Victory Bond book, they have a photograph of all their posters, and this one isn't in there.
If you speak to the breweries that are around,
Oh,
probably
yeah,
that they've got quite a history. I mean, I'm thinking Sleeman's in Guelph. You'll get right back to 1920.
yeah,
you know.
yeah. Yeah, because there wasn't the transportation to get it around and.
What's this?
Oh, that's a link for a computer, so if you type that into the search, I got it from the group I belong to, the Arnhem 1944 Fellowship, and it just shows you some of the activities from Arnhem this year. And there's a nice interview with the only veteran that was there, and he's 98, Jeff Roberts, who I know, and he's sharper now than when I first met him 15 years ago. But as my friend said, these guys who 15 years ago were nobodies, these privates, well, now they're the only ones left, they're the stars of the show.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks again, Bill, and just wanted to remind everyone that November, we have actually 2 speakers coming up, military lecture speakers. On November 3rd, Tim Cook, that's a Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Tim will be talking about his latest book called The Good Allies. That's at 2 o'clock. And then on November 21st, Jeff Hayes, who's another amazing speaker, will return to the Guelph Museums, and he's going to talk about the Canadian Army in the fall of 1944, a reappraisal of their morale and their conditions, because a lot of people thought, oh, the Canadians they're downtrodden, their morale is bad. And he's got a reappraisal of that and how the Canadian troops were fighting and their morale conditions and how they were. So 2 more amazing talks coming up, and if you want to be appraised of these talks, you can just sign a list at the front desk, and we'll send you an email when they're on their way up. But thanks again, Bill. You've been talking for a long time, so take a break, get some water, and appreciate you coming out tonight.
Ken, can I have my walker?